This is Yareli, our newest Prime Warframe, unbeatable tank, broken strong damage dealer, and probably one of the most underrated frames in the entire game. I'm kinda guilty of that myself. So, in this Warframe guide, I'm planning to right my wrongs and show you just how broken strong Yareli Prime really is, and of course, I have multiple builds prepared for you, both for new players as well as Steel Path veterans, so you can get your personal Yareli to delete absolutely everything. Big shoutouts to all our generous channel members who help me keep the lights on, and now, let's jump right into it. First of all, let's go over Yareli's abilities, starting out with the passive, and this one is actually pretty straightforward. Whenever you're on the move, you receive a 200% crit chance buff to secondary weapons. This buff is additive to base crit chance, so it kinda like works as if every secondary weapons in your hands has Creeping Bullseye installed, which is definitely very nice and makes Yareli a great weapons platform, especially if you intend to use secondary weapons. Ability number 1 is called Snares, and this further enhances Yareli's qualities as a secondary weapons platform. What this does is very simple. You shoot out a handful of water bubbles, and these not only crowd control enemies in the air, making their heads perfectly exposed, but they also inflict damage vulnerability to those enemies, meaning they also die extremely fast. Damage vulnerability of this ability scales with ability strength, meaning that if you have enough strength, you're gonna deal even more damage than you see right here. Just make sure to not use Nautilus with this ability, because as you can see here, when Nautilus pulls in enemies that are affected by Snares, they just somehow float up into the air, and that is not really nice. Ability number 2 is called Merulina, and this is basically Yareli's signature ability. Once you activate it, Yareli will bring out her loyal companion Merulina, and this is basically a sea creature that works exactly like a K-Drive, the movement system is exactly the same, and you can also do tricks on it. But that's not all. While you're on top of Merulina, you will also get a 90% damage reduction, that damage that you're not taking instead being redirected to Merulina. As you also see here in the background, you're barely taking any damage at all. Yareli herself, when mounting Merulina, will be invulnerable for 4 seconds, which is a very good panic button, and also once you dismount Merulina, you will have another 1.5 seconds of invulnerability. Now, Merulina not only has one but actually 2 augments, one for when you actually enjoy the playstyle of riding Merulina like a K-Drive, and the other one if you rather keep your feet on the ground. Let's start with that first. With this augment, when you cast Merulina, you're actually not gonna ride on top of her, but she becomes a companion and stays by your side. While Merulina is on the battlefield, she will occasionally attack enemies with Snares, however only 1 per target, therefore it is a nice thing but not all too amazing all on its own. However, all the other features like the 90% damage reduction as well as the 4 seconds of invulnerability after casting will still be available even in this form, only difference being that once you get rid of Merulina, you will not get the 1.5 seconds of invulnerability that you would get when you were standing on her. As for the second augment, Merulina Guardian, this is tailor-made for when you're actually riding on top of Merulina, because it makes it that whenever you take out an enemy stunned by your first ability, that will heal Merulina, keeping her on the field for much longer, and whenever you do heal her in this way, you will gain plus 200% reload speed as well as fire rate on your secondary weapon. So yeah, long story short, if you like the K-Drive playstyle, then Merulina Guardian might actually be a decent option, not necessarily a must-have, but definitely nice. However, if you rather keep your feet on the ground and play like a quote-unquote normal Warframe, then I think Loyal Merulina, to make that happen, is an absolute must, otherwise you're not gonna have much fun playing Yareli. Ability number 3 is called Aquablades, and I personally am not the biggest fan of it, even though the Yareli animation clearly seems to disagree. What this does is, it surrounds Yareli with a ring of Aquablades that deal slash damage to enemies that come in contact with it, and also stagger those enemies around. All in all, the damage that these deal is not that bad if you mod her right, especially if you attack the enemy with your first ability Snares and keep him in place, then you can inflict quite a lot of slashes on the enemy that deal a good chunk of damage. But of course, then again on the other side, we still have a Yareli that absolutely shreds enemies away with her weapons, so the question is if we really need Snares to deal damage to our enemies. If you ask me, then I would say if you want to use a Helminth ability on Yareli, then probably Aquablades would be the slot where you want to put it in. Now, Aquablade also has an augment, which kinda sorta turns Aquablades into the water version of Ash Shuriken, because it makes it that whenever Aquablades is on, you can repress the ability button to throw out one Aquablade with infinite punch through that increases its damage by every enemy that it passes through. Now, there is a secret little interaction here that I wanted to mention, and that is when you use the compressor, Yareli's signature weapon, and shoot the bubbles with it and then throw one of your surging blades into those bubbles, then you can create a sort of stationary surging blade bubble that shreds absolutely everything that gets into it, but I think all in all this is more of a neat gimmick and nothing that you would specifically build for. And the last skill on today's list is called Riptide, and this one, in my opinion, is actually pretty underrated. What this does is pretty simple. It's a big grouping ability with a surprisingly high range, especially if you mod for range, you can drag enemies in from a far distance. If you either let the Riptide time out or press the button again, you will deal cold damage to all the enemies inside, but as you can also see here, the damage is not great. What makes this skill so incredibly good is that you can kinda sorta cosplay as Zephyr here and just deal AoE damage to the enemies inside, which absolutely shreds away everything, specifically if you go for a weapon with blast or gas. And as always, if you could maybe give the video a quick like, that would be super awesome because it always helps me big time with the YouTube algorithm. So cheers so much for your support. Now, before we go into how to build Yareli herself, I would first like to take a quick look at which weapons are optimal for her, because I think specifically for Yareli, it's really important to pick the right guns. First of all, while you can of course play her with primary, secondary, and melee weapons, ideally you want to use a pistol in order to be able to benefit off of her passive, giving you a massive 200% crit chance bonus. However, one important thing to keep in mind here is, this bonus works like mods, meaning if your secondary weapon has barely any base crit chance, you're probably not even gonna notice it. Next, as I previously said, if you want to group enemies up with your Riptide to absolutely shred all of them at once, then I would recommend going for a gas or blast build, kinda like you would do on Zephyr, meaning you really want to put an elementalist as well as a faction damage mod onto your weapon of choice. And the final tip is, if you don't have a go-to melee weapon already, then I would recommend going for the Firax, the MK1 Firax, or the Firax Wraith, and equip them with the Amalgam Firax body count, because this gives a 45% fire rate bonus to all types of secondary weapons, meaning much appreciated. And in case you want to have some specific weapon suggestions, then my personal favorites here were the dual Toxicist Incarnon, especially when I use Snares because it nicely exposes the enemy's heads, the Occucore because it is simply one of the most broken secondary weapons in the game, and finally, my personal favorite, the Furious Incarnon, specifically when you go for the grouping playstyle with Riptide, because as you also see in the background, it completely shreds everything in that bubble in just a split second. But now that we know what Yareli can do and also which weapons you might want to look into, let's finally talk about what you came here for, and that would be the builds, and when it comes to that, I want to start out with the beginner build. This right here would be a very simple beginner build, focusing on a little bit of everything, but mainly using mods that are easy to get in the early game. In the aura, use whatever you like. Then we go with continuity, just so our abilities last a little bit longer. Redirection, because we don't actually need to tank with our health. With all the damage reduction from Merulina that we're getting, our shields are going to be strong enough to handle most of the star chart no problem. More strength with Intensify, so that the damage vulnerability that we're inflicting with our first ability is higher, so we deal more damage to the enemies. And then I went for 2 range mods, Stretch as well as Augur Reach, so we have 175% range, which is nice because this way our 4th ability pulls in enemies from a 26.25 meter range, which is very cool and should be able to clear most rooms that you're gonna encounter. And then finally, our energy economy is gonna be solved with Streamline to make ability casting cheaper, Equilibrium for the energy income, as well as Flow so that we have more maximum energy. This way, you shouldn't struggle at all to cast all the abilities in the world that you want. So much for the beginner build. How about we now take a bit of a deep dive and talk about Steel Path friendlier options. The way this build works in practice is pretty darn simple. Once the mission starts, you bring out your Merulina to give your 90% damage reduction. Then you spam your first ability to make sure that the enemies are incapacitated and take more damage from you, and of course you have your fourth ability to pull them all in and deal massive damage with your weapon. If you want to use a Helminth ability, then put that in your third slot and use it however you see fit. But you know what? Why don't we just talk about which Helminth abilities you could choose on her? First off, as per usual, we have the standard. Roar if you want to deal more damage, Nourish for the viral priming and to never have to worry about energy at all, Eclipse for another layer of 75% damage reduction, especially nice if you want to go and face tank Elite Archimedia. With this, no problem. But, and this is a bit more in depth, you could go and use Garuda's Blood Altar because for whatever reason, while it is officially not possible to heal Merulina with any healing ability, Blood Altar is actually still able to do that, at least as long as you're riding on top of her. So if you want to go for a K-Drive type of playstyle, Blood Altar might actually be a pretty decent idea. However, another match made in heaven would be Evade from Side 09 because it solves one of Yareli's biggest problems. On the one hand, it makes you invisible, meaning you won't get hit, solving your survivability problems, but especially because you can open up enemies for headshots so easily with your first ability, it's also absolutely no problem to keep this up constantly. Plus, with Evade, you can also use Arcane Crepuscular, giving you 30% more ability strength and a fat extra 3x crit damage multiplier, which synergizes very nice with the crit chance bonus that you get from your passive. Let's next talk about the mods, and the first thing I want to get into here is survivability, because for Yareli, there are a lot of options and it's not as black and white as some people might make it look. First off, if you want to go into very high level content, then naturally, just like with most other frames, you have to go for shield gating, but given the 4-second invulnerability whenever you summon Merulina, and the 1.5 seconds additional invulnerability if you ride on her and then dismount, Yareli makes shield gating much more comfortable than most others. So in case you want to go for shield gating, that's a pretty decent option here, where you would probably go for Brief Respite in the aura and or combine that with the Augur mod set to make sure that you can spam abilities to keep your shield up constantly. Add in Rolling Guard for that additional oopsie protection, and you have a Yareli that is actually capable of making it all the way to level cap. However, just because Yareli is a good shield gating frame does not mean you have to do that. See, with the relatively high base shields that she has, plus the 90% damage reduction that Merulina provides, you can actually turn your Yareli into a very good shield tank. Just go for Primed Redirection, Adaptation, bring out your Merulina, and as I previously mentioned, if you want to be super duper safe and be able to even face tank Elite Archimedia, then you can throw in Mirage's Eclipse as a Helminth ability for another 75% damage reduction on top, ending you up at over 700,000 effective hit points, which is definitely nothing to scoff at. Let's also take a look at the Archon charts, where you actually have a ton of options with Yareli. First off, and this is something that I would more recommend than other things, going for 2 yellow shards, either normal or maybe even Tau Forged, into more casting speed, because with Yareli you're gonna be casting quite a lot of skills, and especially if you go for, let's say, shield gating, where you need to spam stuff in order to just stay alive in the first place, casting speed is very much appreciated. As for the other 3, since she is a secondary focused frame and gets crit chance for secondary weapons, I decided to just double down into that with 3 more orange Tau Forged shards that give us a total of 150% additional crit chance, but this is not a must. You could of course also go for red Archon shards here, maybe for more ability strength, maybe for more ability duration, whatever you see fit, or even blue ones if you don't want to go for a flow mod. Yareli has a whole lot of base energy, so maybe 1, 2, or 3 blue ones can already fit all your energy needs, and everything else here of course also goes, just make it so that it fits your personal playstyle. Now, for the builds in total, we have a ton of different options today because Yareli can suit so many different playstyles. The first one we have here is a very safe build where it's very hard to kill you and you're focused on shield tanking. That's why, as a Helminth ability, we use Mirage's Eclipse right here to get damage reduction. Then combine that with a healthy mix of ability strength as well as duration, so we go with Growing Power in the Aura, Mold Augmented, Blind Rage, as well as Umbral Intensify for the strength, Primed Continuity for the duration, the energy comes from Equilibrium and Primed Flow, and then the tankiness from Primed Redirection as well as Adaptation. For this build, I used Loyal Merulina because I didn't want to ride on her, but if you do like the riding on Merulina playstyle, you would simply swap it out with Merulina Guardian and then use the build the same way as before. Just one little trick that I use here, I went for Arcane Aegis so that my shields would constantly regenerate, which makes her even tankier on this build, and with this it should be absolutely 100% no problem to even face tank Elite Temporal Archimedia. However, if you don't like tanking, then maybe we can talk about shield gating. This right here would be a setup for shield gating that I tend to like to use. Of course, we go for brief respite in the aura, as well as prime sure-footed and rolling guard, just to have that 100% safety that we're not gonna caught off guard. Again, equilibrium and prime flow for the energy economy. Arcane Aegis because it is very handy for shield tanking setups, but if you don't like it, you could swap it out for literally anything else. And then the rest is relatively similar than before. Only difference is that here we use Nourish as a Helminth Subsume because it gives us a ton of energy, which we will need because, you know, when you're shield gating, then you're spamming a lot of abilities, costing a lot of energy, so Nourish solves that no problem. And also here, swap out the augment as you see fit. Maybe you go for Merulina Guardian, maybe you go for Loyal Merulina, maybe you don't go for any augment at all. It's your personal choice. And lastly, and this is my personal favorite, would be the invisibility build, because this works incredibly well on Yareli. You subsume Cyto9's Evade, as I said in the Helminth section, that makes you invisible, and then use your first ability to stun the enemies in a way that their heads are exposed. This way you can keep Evade up constantly, and that's basically what this whole build is focused around, going for a lot of strength, so you get more damage vulnerability, as well as duration, so that Evade stays on comfortably. Just that this time we're gonna go for Narrow-Minded to have even more ability duration, because with this build here, we don't really need her for all that much, since this way you can't get headshots, so the reduced range doesn't hurt all too much. And this is very important here, go for Arcane Crepuscular. This gives you not only more ability to strength, but also 3 times more final crit damage multiplier, which synergizes perfectly with Yareli because she already gives so much crit chance to your pistols, and since we're going to be constantly invisible thanks to Evade, Arcane Crepuscular will naturally be on constantly too. But which are your favorite Helminth abilities? Let us know in the comments down below. And if you want to see another broken strong pistolier Warframe, then don't miss my updated Mesa guide right here. Another massive shout out to Niels V, Demon Lord Cell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Noslinix Gaming, Turtlepeer, Lycan Shepherd, Andakanio 2, Pepperwolf, Mihawky, Phil the Meme, Socrates the Almighty Rat, Leo Murasaki, Damon, Shadow Lockhart, Troller Loxon, Kiski, Heontagas, Patrisator, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other, hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.